Welcome to our journey of transformation. We're in the fourth stage of our journey, loving God with all of our strength, and we're in this third study of that stage, which is about today, where does our strength come from? We've learned from the lost son and from the teachings of Jesus that loving the Father with all of our strength means to love like he loves. And if we love like he loves, then we'll love unconditionally. And the meaning of this love, unconditional love, is seen in the practice of it. Because, for instance, it means to show mercy, to relieve people's suffering without raising questions about whether the person deserves it or not. It's unconditional mercy. It means to be patient, consistently patient with those, even with those who are not patient with us. It means to forgive instead of demanding some kind of repayment. It means to humble ourselves, to help others or to care for others, even when they don't help us. It means to be gentle with people, even when they're severe with us. And this level of love, this unconditional love, requires so much strength. It's actually the highest achievement for humans, really. The moral achievement for humans is to love unconditionally. But it's not natural, it's not normal. We have to love those who don't love us. We're not used to or are accustomed to loving unconditionally. We expect something in return. It makes us feel vulnerable. It puts it at risk because somebody might take advantage of our kindness. It requires our constant focus and conscious effort to practice it because it's not automatic. We have to pay lots of attention to what we're doing and saying and even thinking to love unconditionally. And it requires perseverance and consistency because the object of loving unconditionally is to live in love, like our Father is love. And when we live in love, he lives in us and we live in him. So where does this strength come from? The lost son needed this kind of strength, of course, because when he loved like his father loved, that meant to love his brother like his father loved his brother. To love his brother with the same unconditional love that his father loved his brother with. It meant to show compassion, patience, kindness, and forgiveness to his brother unconditionally. The problem was his brother was abusive, criticized him, had a very negative attitude about him, was very judgmental, because the younger son had gone to the far country and wasted his inheritance. And his comments, the comments of the older brother, could always make the younger one tempted to feel shame or guilt again. He would need strength to love his brother like his father loved his brother. How could he do it? How could he withstand the comments of his brother? Only with a firm perception of himself, a strong view of himself and his value, could he be solid and not moved by his brother's comments. He knew his father had restored him and made him a son again. But those emotions, the contentment, the peace, the joy of being restored must gradually become stronger than the emotions of shame and guilt that he felt before. He knew he was not that person that he was before. But his brother's comments and criticism could bring up that shame and guilt again. So he had to be strong. And his strength would come from his relationship with his father and the perception his father had of him. Because that's really what mattered. He wanted to be a son, the right kind of son for his father now, a son who reflected his father. And to follow in his father's image, he would love like his father loved. And when he felt weak, what he really needed to do was spend time with his father. Go for a walk with his father. Thank his father for loving him so. Talk with him about how to love his brother. To strengthen his perception of himself as a son that was really trying to follow in the image of his father. So what did we learn? The strength to love unconditionally has to come from an unwavering understanding of our value as a person before God. To have a strong and healthy perception of ourselves, to withstand however people happen to receive our love, whether they reject it or accept it. It doesn't matter. We'll keep on loving because we know who we are and who we want to be. In Romans chapter 8, Paul emphasized this to the Christians he was writing to in Rome. Let's read from Romans chapter 8, beginning with verse 14. He's celebrating the fact that we are children of God. He says, because those who are led by the Spirit of God are the sons of God. For you did not receive a spirit that makes you a slave again to fear, but you received the spirit of sonship. And by him we cry, Abba, Father. The Spirit himself testifies with our spirit that we are children of God. And now if we are children, we are heirs, heirs of God and co-heirs with Christ, if indeed we share in his sufferings, in order that we may also share in his glory. That's beautiful. He's celebrating our relationship with the Father. And that's what we need to do. To have the strength to love others unconditionally, we need to celebrate our relationship with our Father. Celebrate the perception he has given us, the new perception he has given us of ourselves as his children, meant to reflect him. We know that the second greatest command is to love your neighbor as you love yourself. So the love you have for your neighbor will depend, first of all, on having a healthy love for yourself. Because if you have a healthy love for yourself, then you don't have to pretend, you don't have to defend yourself or protect yourself any longer. You can just love unconditionally. And that healthy love for ourselves comes from our perception of who we are as children of God. We have to respect ourselves and appreciate who we are in God's sight. But it doesn't mean we're arrogant or proud or self-righteous, because we know that who we are as children of God, we have become children by his grace and mercy. He's forgiven us and made us new again. And so because of that, we can humbly love unconditionally. I want you to think about the example of Jesus too, because he loved based on his relationship with his Heavenly Father. In John chapter 13, John tells us about a scene that happened right before Jesus died the next day, in the night before he died, when he met with his disciples in an upper room in Jerusalem to partake of or to celebrate the feast of the Passover. Before Jesus arrived in the room, his disciples prepared the meal, and as they were preparing for it, apparently they were arguing about who was the greatest among them, perhaps so that they could decide who was going to sit next to Jesus. And he had talked to them before about this and warned them not to be lifted up so much in pride to argue about things that were meaningless, about who was the greatest among them, because actually the greatest would have to be the one who serves. Well, he comes into the room then, and they're discussing this again. And instead of correcting them or teaching them with words, he begins to wash their feet. You probably know the story. But I want us to read what John says before that happened, because he tells us something about Jesus' mentality that night when he washed their feet. In John chapter 13, beginning with verse 1, John says, "It was just before the Passover feast. Jesus knew that the time had come for him to leave this world and go to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he now showed them the full extent of his love." And later it says in verse 3, Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power, and that he had come from God and was returning to God. So you see what he's saying. He was about to show them the full extent of his love, how deeply, how unconditionally he loved them. But he was able to do that because he knew he had come from the Father and was going to the Father, and he had accomplished the Father's will. Being able to love his disciples and love them completely, even though they didn't understand sometimes his teachings, although they kept on being lifted up in pride towards each other instead of humbling themselves. They didn't respond. Anybody else might think, well, I'm not a good teacher if they're not listening to me and not doing what I say. Maybe there's something wrong with me as a teacher. But there wasn't anything wrong with Jesus as a teacher. It was in them, something in them that still was fighting to protect themselves and to defend themselves. And they would change. They would eventually change. And a lot would depend on what they saw that evening when Jesus washed their feet. But Jesus was able to continue to love them, continue to guide them and lift them up, not because of their response to him, but because of who he was to the Father. He knew he had come from the Father, and he knew he was going to the Father. That's a great example to us, because our strength, too, to love unconditionally, to keep on loving, comes from our relationship with the Father. To love unconditionally, we have to love from a perception, a strong perception. And this is the kind of perception the Father has given to us, a strong perception of who we are. And whether people accept our love or reject it, whether they abuse it or they love in return, it doesn't matter, because our love, our unconditional love, depends on who we are, who we want to be as children of God. In moments when we feel weak, we can spend time with the Father, meditate on him, read his word, pray to him, talk to him, and let him strengthen our perception of ourselves. We make mistakes. We know we're not perfect. There are many times when we don't love like we should love, but we know his patience and his gentleness with us keeps us going. And he maintains this connection with us as his children. So we live in love, and he lives in us, and we live in him. And this gives us a strong, unwavering perception of ourselves that allows us to love unconditionally, instead of being worried about protecting ourselves and defending ourselves against people who might abuse our love. This is what this love looks like. And it's a love that comes from the Father to our spirits. You know, unconditional love is a quality of our spirits. It's not just a chemical, electrical reaction in our brains. This unconditional love is a quality of our spirits. It's a conscious choice that we make deep within our spirits and not an automatic reaction. So we need strength in our spirits. And our spirits have emotions that move us to love. The closeness we feel to the Father when we know he's present with us, the joy, the peace, the contentment that we feel from his presence. It's a strength that comes from his spirit to our spirit. And it comes to us because of the perception he gives to us that's true and adequate, that we're his children. He continues loving us and does not stop loving us. And so we can begin to love as he loves, without fear, without being afraid of being vulnerable, without being afraid to love people who don't love us. We can value the Father's perception of us and be able to love freely. And with this perception, we can love our neighbor as we love ourselves. So his grace and his mercy also put a kind of obligation on us to love as we have loved. I want you to read with me in John chapter 13, verse 34 and 35, where Jesus also encourages his disciples to love others as he has loved them. Listen to what he says. John 13, verse 34 and 35. A new command I give you, love one another as I have loved you, so you must love one another. By this all men will know that you are my disciples, if you love one another. So as I have loved you, so you must love one another. Love because you have been loved. In John chapter 15, in the same way he says in verse 12, my command is this, love each other as I have loved you. So his love for us puts us in sort of an obligation to love, a logical obligation. We don't love because we're obligated to love. We love because we want to be like the Father. But at the same time, it just makes sense for us to love as we have been loved. It's just, it's fair, it's what's right. It's what we ought to do. And we get strength from that, knowing that if he's loved us so much, we ought to love others in the same way. In addition, his Spirit that lives in us also strengthens our spirit to be able to love consistently and persevere in love. This strength comes directly from his Spirit to our spirit. Paul mentions this kind of help in Ephesians chapter 3. Let's read from Ephesians chapter 3, beginning with verse 14. Here, Paul explains to the Ephesians that he had been praying for them, praying that the Father would strengthen them in their spirits to be able to love consistently. But listen to what he says. For this reason I kneel before the Father, from whom his whole family in heaven and on earth derives its name. I pray that out of his glorious riches he may strengthen you with power through his Spirit in your inner being, so that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith. And I pray that you, being rooted and established in love, may have power together with all the saints to grasp how wide and long and high and deep is the love of Christ. So what's he doing? He's praying that the Father would strengthen them in their inner being, in their spirits, through the Spirit, his Spirit that lives in them. For what purpose? To love, to be rooted and established in love. That's a consistent love that doesn't vacillate. A love that's strong. And that love would help them understand how deep and wide and long and high the love of God is. So here's a kind of strength that comes directly from God's Spirit to our spirit. And we can pray for it. In moments when you feel weak, when you're confronted with individuals trying to love them and they abuse or take advantage of this love, that's the time to pray. That God would strengthen you in your spirit through his Spirit who lives in you. That you could be rooted and established in love. Then finally, practice. The practice of loving like our Father loves reinforces our perception of ourselves. Because when we practice unconditional love, every time we practice unconditional love, we're showing that we really are his children. That we really want to be his children. It reinforces this perception we have of being his children. When we practice unconditional love, it's real. We are his children, and we're demonstrating that we belong to him by loving as he loves. So we're going to be continuing to talk about how we can love God with all of our strength. May God bless you.